Welcome everyone to another Facebook Live discussion on the future of tobacco research. We're coming to you live from the NYU College of Global Public Health. Today I'm joined by two NYU faculty facilitators of the Tobacco Research Lab here at NYU. Today we're going to talk about the tobacco industry, tobacco research, as well as its role in public health. I'm Deborah Nakamaya, and I'm going to be your host today. I'm joined by Dr. Nyara and Dr. Abrams, who are both professors of social behavioral sciences here at GPH. Thank you guys so much for being here today.
Pleasure.
Yeah, and to our audience there, please leave our panelists questions about our discussion. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So can you tell me just a little bit about, your research and your background and your work with the Tobacco Lab?
Sure. So since my doctoral dissertation, which is more than 40 years ago, I've been interested in addictions and the harm they cause and how to both treat them and prevent them. So I got interested in tobacco during that time when I was at Rutgers University, where I got my doctorate in the mid-70s. And so I've been doing tobacco research and research into nicotine and how to reduce the harms since that time, so pretty much my whole career. And also my dad died of a heart attack at age 60 and was a heavy smoker, so there's a personal interest and commitment to saving lives from preventing or helping people not to smoke cigarettes, which are the biggest killer.
How about you, Dr. Nyara?
Well, I don't go back as far as David does, but similarly, I've been doing tobacco-related work since about 1984 or so. So I guess that does date me a little bit, but
Before I was born.
oh well, gosh, all right. So yeah, and like David, we've kind of seen things come and go in the tobacco research field, smoking cessation field, and now we are interested in studying sort of new sets of issues and challenges that have arisen in the past few years. Tobacco is now a regulated product by the FDA since 2009, I believe. And so in a way, it's a brave new world, and in some ways it's still an ugly old world.
Definitely. And you mentioned something around harm reduction. I think my next question is around e-cigarettes. Is it a viable strategy to get to reduce tobacco use? There are several people in different school of thoughts, so.
Sure. Well, the short answer is yes, and there's no doubt about that. The National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine literally published their comprehensive review just a few weeks ago, showing that it's dramatically less harmful than combusted cigarettes. So I would say that the short answer is that delivering nicotine without burning the tobacco leaves, which causes the 7,000 chemicals, carbon monoxide, and over 70 known human carcinogens, almost none of that is in e-cigarettes. There's way less harm and in much lower levels. That's not to say it's harmless, but it's dramatically less harmful, and therefore completely switching from smoking cigarettes or any combusted tobacco where you're burning the tobacco leaf to an e-cigarette, or using e-cigarettes to help you quit everything, is definitely a viable strategy and might assist us in speeding the demise of using combusted tobacco, i.e. burnt tobacco, and saving, we estimate, could be 1 billion lives worldwide that are going to die prematurely if they keep smoking cigarettes, but not necessarily caused by the nicotine, but caused by the burning of the tobacco leaf.
Well, what's interesting about e-cigarettes, and I agree with David, I think they are, measurably much safer than smoking cigarettes. But most smokers who are using these products, especially people that have been smoking a long time, tell us that they're using them to try to help to quit smoking regular cigarettes. So that's a clue that these folks are, interested in the possibility these products can be helpful, weaning them off regular cigarettes. And where we come in as researchers is that this whole issue is actually hard to study. Because this is a sort of a consumer behavior, so it's not like a medicine like nicotine replacement therapy. So consumers are buying the products on their own. They're using them. We don't have a really good understanding of how they're using them, how long it takes them to switch off of regular cigarettes to e-cigarettes. And that's where we come in. And we're interested in doing that kind of, field research to understand how it is that the people can make the switch successfully. But that, as I mentioned, that's hard research to do because you need to find the people out there who are using the products. You need to be able to study them sort of in their natural environments. But we try to think up new and innovative ways to do that kind of research.
And I would say, you've mentioned it as a form of harm reduction, and a lot of people these days are, starting off just using e-cigarettes, maybe younger generations of people, rather than using burning tobacco, as opposed to they are currently using e-cigarettes. Would you say that, are they reducing their chances of, getting lung cancer or other types of cancer just because they're using that? Or like, what would you say to people that use e-cigarettes? I would.
Well, so let me ask you to qualify that question. So you mentioned, young people, older people, smokers, because I might have a different message for who the, depending on who the smokers are. So if it's a young person, I'd say, no, don't use any nicotine-containing product. It's not a smart idea. If it's a current smoker, then I might say, well, you should, if you haven't already been thinking about quitting smoking, you should, and this is one way of doing it. There are lots of different ways that you could try to quit, but e-cigarettes would be one thing. But then to get to your question about, well, and I think what you're getting at is, are there, long-term harms from using these products?
Or is there enough research out there to support, the use of e-cigarettes as for harm reduction, or is it worse? Like, is there any effect of using e-cigarettes as opposed to?
Yeah, well, one thing I can tell you is that when you look at studies that look at actual biological effects of using e-cigarettes, so in other words, levels of toxins in the body, and in people, not in mice or rats, those studies almost 100% tell us that if they use e-cigarettes, switch completely, then their level of toxins is going to go down dramatically. So that to me is an indication that they're being exposed to fewer toxins that are responsible for death and disease. Long term, nobody knows anything because we don't have the decades-long experience yet with e-cigarettes that we do, unfortunately, with regular cigarettes. But I would say all the signs are looking positive.
Okay, so there's still a lot of research to be done around that.
Well, yes, but I would qualify what Ray is saying, although I 100% agree with him. What I worry about is that there's a lot of misinformation about the harms of e-cigarettes that have caught the headlines. And it's often picking up on one study that looked at, let's say, one type of e-cigarette in an extreme way and said there are some harms here. What we are concerned about is that the public don't seem to have accurate information and they're confused. The polls that have said how harmful are e-cigarettes compared to cigarettes, the public were more accurate 5 or 8 years ago when they said mostly their e-cigarettes are much less harmful. Now a lot of people are saying they're equally harmful or more harmful because of these big headlines that I think have exaggerated a few small studies that are actually not real-world studies. One example is there was this big scare about formaldehyde in e-cigarettes and acrolein, which seems to be associated only in popcorn lung in workers in popcorn factories. But people have used the fact that those two chemicals, acrolein and formaldehyde, were present in e-cigarettes. And this one study, they really had a very high voltage that people couldn't inhale, but the machine could produce toxic fumes. And one of our colleagues said it's kind of like taking a piece of white toast and putting it in a regular toaster, and then holding the toaster down until the white toast burnt to a crisp. and was black, and then eating it and saying it's full of toxins. So the truth is that there is very little formaldehyde above and beyond what you see in the environment in most of the latest, highest quality e-cigarettes, if they're used as intended, not overused or overheated. But the public have been scared, and so they mistakenly believe e-cigarettes are as harmful when they're dramatically less harmful. And as I just said, the American National Academy of Science did a comprehensive review and concluded they're much less harmful based on all the biomarkers we know today. And so did the British Royal College of Physicians, a very prestigious and reliable organization. So the problem is, of course, we can't have long-term data 30, 40, 50 years from now. And so we have to say we don't know for sure the complete picture. But I would say that we actually know what all the biomarkers of cancer are. There are about 60 of them, or 65 or so in cigarettes, and in e-cigarettes used under normal circumstances, especially newer, higher quality ones, there's way fewer of those chemicals, and of the ones that are there, a fair number are in trace levels that people say wouldn't damage humans at all, and a few are at low levels, so they're not harmless, and therefore, you know, the only way you can get no harm is to stop using everything. But it's A, not the nicotine, and B, I think we do know fairly definitively, based on data now, that the markers we think would cause long-term harm are just not there in the number or the levels that we see in cigarettes. So to me, it's highly unlikely that just saying we don't know the future should scare us from saying right now what we do know is that they're much less harmful. And if you are a smoker and you've tried everything else, you should switch or quit everything if you possibly can. And if you're a potential smoker, you're better off using e-cigarettes than progressing to cigarettes. But again, if you're not using anything, there's no reason why you should try them or try any nicotine product, because there is harm in whatever you're doing, and you shouldn't do it.
And just to add to that, I think it's important to make the point that we shouldn't give all e-cigarettes a free pass. Some products are worse and some products are better. But now the FDA is their job is to regulate these products, and they're in the process of doing that. So we have to rely on the FDA, we have to rely on science to tell us, okay, which are the products now that are actually better, safer, have better quality, better and safer ingredients. And that's a process that's, starting to happen. So, and we've kind of seen that over the past 3 or 4 years, where I think the quality of products has been steadily, improving. And that's what we advocate, is making sure that these products, are relatively safe, and that they continue to improve in quality.
And we would support regulation, because I think prudent regulation of these products with product standards that say, here are the minimum levels you're allowed to have of certain chemicals, would allow us to say to the public, the FDA has said these levels are acceptable, anything above this level is not okay. Even though they are dramatically less harmful, we now have quality control standards monitored by the FDA, which would ensure that we know the harm of these much less harmful products. So that would be a good thing, to have regulation that would set some standards to minimize the harm, but not eliminate it.
That's true. The way I like to think it is, a little bit of everything will always kill you. Drink too much water, you're gonna die.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and we have an audience question. Aaron, Jonathan would like to know, can these interventions be cost effective in LMICs like Uganda and so on, to be precise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, it's quite possible, but there's virtually no information about use of these products in almost any LMIC, which is unfortunate, because and that's just the story of tobacco control. Tobacco control efforts have been lagging behind in these countries, and that includes new products like e-cigarettes and so forth. So we know very little about how these products are being distributed or marketed or how they're being used. And I think that's a tremendous area for potential research that ought to be done.
Yeah, there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah, it could be a unique opportunity. You know, one of the issues that clearly is there is the economics. And that if e-cigarettes are a little more expensive, let's say, then that becomes a bit of a problem for substituting or implementing them. You know, it's a little bit like HIV/AIDS medications where they may be expensive, and if you don't have subsidized health care, or if you know, there isn't a way to have access, then the LMICs are at a disadvantage in providing them for their population. So it's a struggle, and I think we ought to be attending more to low and middle income countries, because that's where a fairly large number of burning tobacco and combusted smoking occurs, and we know that a lifetime of smoking cigarettes or any, you know, even roll your own burning tobacco, about half the people who use them for a lifetime will die prematurely from that kind of way of getting your nicotine through the burning of tobacco. And that's predominantly in low-income populations here in America as well as in LMICs. So we've got a lot to do to save lives and to do the kind of global policy work that we think is so important. E-cigarettes could play a role, but it's tricky, and it will be different in different countries depending on the culture and the arrangements and so on.
Yeah, definitely. I think my next question is, you know, let's talk a little bit about nicotine in the brain. You know, why is tobacco so addictive? Why are young people prime customers specifically for the tobacco industry?
Well, so one thing to understand about nicotine in the brain is that the brain, and actually the entire body, is filled with what are called nicotinic acetylcholinergic receptors. And so these are naturally occurring receptors to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And nicotine molecularly mimics the effects of acetylcholine. So it'll affect things like muscle contraction. But there are a whole variety of these, you know, receptors in the brain in particular that, you know, serve all kinds of different functions, you know, that influence memory processes, sensory, gating, attention, things like that. So you're putting into your body with nicotine sort of an analog of a neurotransmitter that has all of these, you know, powerful effects, mostly in terms of, you know, stimulation, but a lot of other effects. So that's going to, you know, have some probably quite positive benefits to people in terms of making them feel better, you know, increasing their attention capacity, things like that. That's going to be reinforcing. And that I think figures into why nicotine becomes addictive. The withdrawal of nicotine also can cause withdrawal symptoms in people. So, you know, people will want to use more of it just to help control the withdrawal symptoms. So that's all pretty well known. But I think, you know, a related issue is, and that's come up a lot, is whether, and you know, that nicotine has maybe special effects or more pronounced effects on a developing brain, so adolescent brain, young brain. And that's probably true to some degree, which is why we said earlier it's not a good idea for, you know, young people to be using nicotine-containing products, any of them. And that's probably true of most drugs. I mean, you would not want to expose the developing brain to even caffeine, I would say. It's not a good idea. But, you know, this whole mix of things, which is, you know, and these effects are lots of diverse effects that differ from person to person, are going to contribute to the reinforcing qualities of it. And I know David will jump in and tell us something about actually some people having a much greater need for nicotine compared to other people.
Yeah, I think there are what we call individual differences. Like, you know, some people like the taste of broccoli and others don't. So the chemicals, you know, we are born with huge genetic variation, and our early childhood experiences influence what we like and what we don't like. So there's certainly a small subset of people who are very vulnerable to the powerful pleasurable effects of nicotine, others somewhere in between, and some can take it or leave it, and others it does nothing for them. So it's within that context that we're talking about. The same with alcohol. You know, most people can drink socially and don't get into trouble, but 6 to 10% of people do develop alcohol-related problems or can't stop drinking, and it ruins their lives until they do stop. So, you know, we've got to be careful to find where the balances are in this. It's not completely addicted to everybody, but as Ray said, we both feel, and I think society and common sense and any parent should feel, I don't want my kids' brains to be exposed to nicotine, marijuana, alcohol, and maybe excess sugar and fat and as well, because it can lead to obesity and so on. But these chemicals all affect the brain, and they change some feelings that you have, and then they make some people want more of them. So that's all part of this very complicated mix that you know, gets to be why nicotine is enjoyable and why some people not only seek it, but once they taste it, and to me, I say it's like tasting chocolate cake. It's hard to forget it when it tastes so good, and then you seek it and you want more of it, and then you find you can't stop. And that's where the problem comes in, because it's not the nicotine itself that causes all the damage. There's a lot of strong research to show that clean nicotine in a nicotine replacement therapy that's a medicine, or in a smokeless form like Swedish snus, which is used in Sweden to a great degree, the nicotine itself doesn't cause a whole lot of harm, but the fact that it makes you want to smoke a cigarette when it's coupled with the burning of the tobacco, and that's the way you get it, that's the problem. So we've both demonized nicotine and cigarettes together, because up until 10 years ago, we couldn't really separate them. If you wanted to get the best chemosensory pleasure out of a product, you'd have to burn it and absorb the nicotine and lots of other taste and chemicals in the burnt cigarette along with that. Now suddenly we have a society and a whole new world, as Ray said, where we can decouple the nicotine from the burning tobacco. So it requires us to rethink nicotine completely when we separate it. And how harmful is the nicotine when it's not part of the carbon monoxide and all the toxins in tobacco? So we're still concerned. I mean, just like we wouldn't want kids to use sugar, marijuana, or nicotine or alcohol in excess or at all until their brains are more developed and they're over, let's say, age 21 at least. It's much more complicated now because we've got different ways of delivering nicotine that are more or less harmful.
And on that point, you know, another kind of, you know, disturbing reality is that the burden of smoking-related illness is really concentrated among certain substrata of the population. So, for example, people with mental illnesses tend to be, you know, there are more smokers in the mental illness population in particular. People who use other drugs, opiate users, for example, very, very high prevalence of smoking. And these folks are more likely to die of a smoking-related illness than from their other problems. Wow. If they live long enough. So a real pressing question for the field is, why are these people really stuck on nicotine, and more importantly on the bad products, the burning products, the cigarettes, and you know, what strategies can we use to get people to quit, to switch to cleaner nicotine products? We really don't know much about all of that, but I think it's a real, you know, important issue, pressing issue.
I would say, you know, now the FDA is talking about decreasing nicotine in tobacco products, and we touched a little bit on that, you know, to non-addictive levels. Would you say that would be a strategy for reducing the risk of addiction in a way, or harm reduction in a way, or?
Yeah, it would. I think if you took the nicotine down to the so-called non-addictive but non-zero level, which is what some of the research the FDA has funded is supporting, it makes sense that if you can get enough nicotine, it won't be as addictive. And I think that is a good idea. to take it out of the combusted products where it's intertwined with the toxins of the burning tobacco, and that's what they're proposing to do. However, I hasten to add that the new commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, and the director of the Center for Tobacco Products, Mitch Zeller, published a new position paper on the FDA's approach to managing nicotine in the future. And they basically said it's a two-pronged approach. We want to reduce the appeal and the addictiveness of combusted tobacco, not necessarily all products with nicotine. And they also said at the same time we want to make available alternative, less harmful products for those smokers who can't quit or who want to use nicotine, maybe because they have a mental illness and this is helping their brains work better. So we've got to be careful about how we manage nicotine in society so that we don't effectively prohibit nicotine completely, because I think that's not a good idea. So the question is, if you take a lot of it out of the combusted cigarette, are you comfortable with leaving it in, say, e-cigarettes in an adequate amount of dosage, and you still keep it away from kids with the same laws we have now? You know, no sales to minors, no predatory marketing, no appealing advertising that might appeal to kids. Can you do that and tolerate a different mode of delivery of nicotine that's okay for those who want or need it as adults, but not combusted, burnt tobacco? And you know, the rest of my career, I think, is devoted to how can we speed getting rid of smoked tobacco in this world. It's sort of like, you know, getting rid of lead in gasoline, or electric cars eventually replacing combustion engine cars. I think we should, as a society, say we have an innovative new technology, something that we haven't had in 120 years since the invention of the cigarette rolling machine in 1882, which was the technology that led to the mass disease of the smoked cigarette. And now, for the first time in 120 years, we have the innovation of e-cigarettes and future creative products like that. And so shouldn't we embrace them if it can speed getting rid of cigarettes as a dinosaur activity that's now past? No one should be burning tobacco anymore to get their nicotine, because it'll kill you, and it's not the nicotine. So how do you balance and thread that needle is, I think, the big challenge of the future, because we're in unknown territory. We never ever had a disruptive technology that could deliver nicotine in a way that truly could be satisfying enough, not the same as, it's obviously going to be different for a smoker who's tasting a cigarette and has used a cigarette for 40 years. But if a smoker can get past that and allow themselves to experience an e-cigarette on a daily basis for a month or 2 or 3, their brain will adapt and they'll start saying, oh, this e-cigarette's not so bad, maybe I can give up my cigarettes. And that's my dream, is to get way more smokers who are going to die prematurely of their smoking to either quit everything, which we've been doing for 30 years with nicotine replacement therapy, but it hasn't been very fast. And now we could speed up the complete demise and elimination of smoked tobacco as an old world, old school activity that no one needs to do anymore.
One more comment on the reduction of nicotine in cigarettes. You know, theoretically, it's a good idea to bring nicotine levels down so they're not as, you know, the products are not as addictive. But it's going to be a very heavy lift for the FDA to do this. You're talking about, you know, 38 million smokers roughly in the United States alone. You know, how hard or easy, probably hard, will it be for the tobacco manufacturers to actually make tobacco that has reduced nicotine? It's not a trivial matter to do that. You know, there are questions like, well, how would you introduce the product? Do you do it all of a sudden or gradually? And then there's the whole issue of the black market. And are people, you know, is this going to increase smuggling? Are people going to find other ways to put nicotine in their tobacco? These are all unanswered questions that the FDA is actually going to have to figure out before they implement any of this.
And that's kind of why I emphasize the two-prong approach that Dr. Gottlieb and Mitch Zeller were promulgating. They're saying we want to reduce and speed the demise of cigarettes by making them less appealing and less attractive and less addictive, while at the same time providing alternative products for adults, because that will avoid the black market. If you've got a good enough e-cigarette type of product, then you might get people to use that and not go to a black market where you might end up with old world roll your own cigarettes, for example, that would be more dangerous than ever before. So it's a thread your needle in policy so that you balance those two prongs of this approach. And we support that as long as they're both there enthusiastically at the same time. I don't think you can take the nicotine out of cigarettes without offering a viable alternative.
I would say, in public health, one of the greatest enemies is the tobacco industry, especially in our field. We always involve in public health, we usually involve stakeholders, in all processes of interventions. Is there any way to engage them on any level in forms of harm reduction, or keeping them as the enemy is best in a way?
So let me jump in here. The important thing that's changed, and yes, historically in public health, we've always tended to view the tobacco industry as sort of this monolithic evil empire. But what's changed is now in the United States and also in other places in the world and the European Union, tobacco products are regulated. They're regulated products. They've always been legal products, but now in addition, they are regulated. And that means that the tobacco industry has to play by the rules that the FDA creates, and actually that the Tobacco Control Act that Congress passed, which created the legislation, that's the roadmap, that's the rule book. So we have to do some soul searching in public health and say, wait a second here, I don't think it makes sense any longer to distance ourselves from the tobacco industry, because now they are compelled to tell the truth by the FDA. And there is also a pathway for modified risk, harm reduction products. They've embarked on this pathway. So my point of view, and we'll see if David agrees, is that this process now needs oversight. And that's now our role as public health scientists. So we need to participate in the process. We need to engage with the industry as well as with the FDA to keep an eye on the process, to make sure that everybody is doing what they're supposed to do and what they say they're going to do. So that's kind of the way I see our role as having evolved from sort of the past of tobacco control. I don't know if David has any
Yeah,
other
I could
comments.
just add a couple things. This is probably the most emotionally contentious issue.
Yeah.
And one of our close colleagues, Ken Warner, who's been doing this work for about as long as we have, has coined the phrase, how to think, not feel about the future. And it's to sort of say, and it's funny, I was watching I'm South African, I was watching the Truth and Reconciliation Commission just the other night with Desmond Tutu, the new movie, The Forgiven. And it talks about how do you work with a society that for 400 years enslaved and murdered and was atrocious to black people in South Africa under the apartheid government. And they found a way to sort of say, moving forward, we have to both acknowledge the past and never forget it, and we're going to hold the industry accountable for all that they have done and learn from that how to keep them accountable. So it's not just trust and verify, it's probably mistrust and therefore verify doubly going forward. But things have changed, just like in South Africa, and how do you deal with an atrocious past while moving forward for everybody? And I think the case can now be made that we've got to rethink how we manage the industry because it is regulated. And is there a way to create what I would call sticks and carrots proportionate to the harm of different products, and therefore say to them, if you want to continue to make money selling nicotine to the population, here's the ways to do it. get rid of combustibles eventually, sooner rather than later, because they kill half your customers and they would want that too. Find ways to sell and market and make much less harmful, satisfying forms of nicotine, and agree to not try to sell them to kids or use predatory marketing to kids. But if you follow those rules, and it's not perfect because we'll be like the alcohol industry or marijuana, kids will use some of this and it's a risk society has to take. But we want to minimize the dangers to kids while not being extremist and say this is an evil empire. The only thing we want is to destroy completely any form of making nicotine other than medication. So it becomes about freedom and choice and risks, just like I said earlier. You want to play football, you're going to have to take some risk of your kids getting brain injuries on the football field. Your only choice is to completely ban football in high school or use helmets and other rules of engagement so that you don't minimize hurting yourself. If we could ever get to a point and wave a magic wand, I think that would speed everything up for everybody. And in fact, several tobacco companies have now made public statements that they want to get out of selling combusted tobacco. People have said, oh, it's another PR ploy. You know, it's just like what they said 20 years ago with the low-tar cigarette. And I would say yes and no. There are two choices here. A, it is a PR ploy. If it is, very soon we'll see the transparency of it and we'll hold them accountable. And particularly since they're regulated, they really can't get away with it as a PR ploy to keep selling cigarettes while saying, oh, we really want to get out of the business. And B, if it's true that they do, why don't we work with them and help them to get rid of the most dangerous, lethal product that's human-made that the world has ever seen? More people have died of tobacco smoke than all the world wars combined. And it's like, yeah, they're kind of bad players in the past, just like the apartheid white government. I would say you certainly should remember everything they've done and hold them accountable. But is there a path forward? Because what we care about the most are smokers using smoked tobacco where they burn the product. And if they especially would be able to find a way to get out of selling burnt tobacco to low and middle income countries, you can't expect it overnight because they're an industry who are accountable to their shareholders. And so you can't just say, well, first stop selling cigarettes and then we'll talk to you.
That's not going to work.
But I think a prudent way of saying, how can we work together to speed the economic demise of combusted tobacco throughout the world? We might be willing to tentatively work with you for a smoke-free world. And if you behave according to the rules, we will support you. And if you don't, we know all your tricks and we're going to be monitoring you and verify every single step of the way. And so I think there is a teeny little window how to think rationally and protect all smokers from the burning of tobacco in the future, while not just emotionally saying it's all evil, we don't want any of these products, which is in fact prohibition. And we know that didn't work for alcohol. You're never going to completely prohibit nicotine use in any form, but you sure as heck, I think, can get rid of combusted tobacco behavior given the new technology. So the answer is a tentative yes, sort of trust and verify. But not really trust, because they have a history where they're going to have to earn that trust one day at a time.
Wow. This has been so amazing. I would want to just wrap things up and ask, so what's next? In 2 sentences, what's next for both of you in tobacco research?
Well, what's next is we are going to be on the forefront of looking at whether these new nicotine delivery system products are actually going to help people to switch. And we're going to, as David said, kind of be keeping an eye on what the industry is doing, but coming to it from a scientific perspective. So we're going to bring the best that we can bring in terms of, current scientific knowledge and expertise.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, I think the science should inform policy and practice. And up to now, we've seen a lot of rhetoric and emotion from well-meaning tobacco control advocates who I think are still using the old school, it's all evil, it's all bad, no product is safe enough to be promoted. And I think in doing that, we're forgetting about smokers. If smokers could have quit, they would have.
Exactly.
I have treated addictions for 40 years. I'm a clinician. I have been in the trenches of hospitals and outpatient clinics. I think, sadly, not everybody appreciates what it's like to work one-on-one with an addict, whether it's a late adolescent or young adult, or a full-blown, smoker who's 55, has chronic obstructive lung disease, cannot quit. And to sort of say, you've got to quit, don't ever try an e-cigarette, even if you've tried NRT and failed 5 times. I'm sorry, there is no safe product. You either quit or you die, I think is wrong. You could say, quit or switch, because you will save your life, your quality of life, and be around for your kids, your grandkids, and the people that love you. Because smokers are still human, and they're equally deserving of love and caring, as is any addict, or anybody with a mental illness, or anybody who looks different. As Desmond Tutu said, tears don't have any pigment or color in them. If you really care about smokers, you'd be thinking about harm reduction, not just all or nothing, quit or die.
Wow, thank you so much for being on our show today. This is amazing. And guys, there's so much research to be done in tobacco. So please reach out to our faculty members here, learn more, and don't forget to visit our website at publichealth.nyu.edu. Thank you.